Let's be clear, Bitcoin is an international asset.
We are spending like drunken sailors.
Bitcoin is the only economic entity where the supply is unaffected by the demand.
If you want to preserve your wealth, you have to convert that currency into an asset that's scarce, desirable, portable, durable, and maintainable.
Hello, my name is Andy Edstrom, and I'm happy to welcome you to the 14th episode of Scarce Assets, a show that examines scarcity, the most fundamental driver of economics and markets, and the scarcest asset of all, which is Bitcoin. Delighted to be here with my co-host Jesse Myers and our guest, Matt Pines. I am especially pleased to be talking with Matt because he's a true expert on geopolitics, and frankly, much of geopolitics is about how nations position themselves to control scarce assets. So Matt is Director of Security Advisory at SentinelOne, which is a leading cybersecurity firm. He's a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, and he's published a number of papers on Bitcoin and national security and related topics. I especially recommend the one entitled Bitcoin and U.S. National Security, in which he did the important work of articulating how Bitcoin enhances U.S. national security while also acknowledging its risks. And Matt also holds a master's of philosophy and public policy from LSE, and he holds a bachelor's in physics from Johns Hopkins. And he's also a novelist. His novel, Expectation Value, was published last year. I just ordered my copy, and I'm looking forward to reading it. So, Matt, thank you for coming on Scarce Assets. How are you?
I'm doing well. Just enjoying the long holiday week. Happy to chat.
Yeah, well, thank you for sitting down with us. I'm really looking forward to this chat. I actually want to start this conversation with a short story. It was April in 2022. It was a Saturday night, and I went to a party, which was graciously hosted by Peter McCormick, and it was at this amazing opulent mansion on Star Island, which is this man-made island next to Miami Beach. And there was a huge outdoor open bar and a DJ and a dance floor, and it was on the waterfront, and the weather was beautiful. It was perfect conditions for a party, with one exception. There must have been 1,000 people at this party, and this party had one extremely scarce asset, which was a single bathroom facility. It was one of these mobile bathroom trailer things, and I think there might have been 2 rooms in it. And the line to use it was breathtakingly long, and moreover, there were security staff crawling all over this place. So they were actively preventing people from relieving themselves elsewhere, either on or near the property. So I had received nature's call and was stuck waiting in line, and I'm not exaggerating, for over an hour. But guess who was in line next to me? Matt Pines. So I got to meet Matt, and I got to pick his brain for over an hour, and I'm so glad I get to do it today. So how do you remember that night, Matt?
I remember you were maybe in worse shape than me. See, I timed it so that because I saw how long the line was, so I was sort of like, I need to position myself for when I would get to the front. And so yeah, I think we were able to have a conversation in moments of varying exigency. But yeah, that was a good intro.
Yeah, well, fortunately, you had a lot of great and interesting things to say. So, the time for me passed quickly, notwithstanding the urgency of my situation. But we'll leave that one. We'll leave that one there for now.
I love the different approach to that situation. Yeah, once in time delivery, inventory management from Andy, and then Matt with the T+45 sort of approach.
I'm always about assessing risk in any environment, and that was an acute risk I had to mitigate.
Yep, I should have known he was thinking strategically from the beginning.
At Onramp, we believe that Bitcoin is the most important asset of the 21st century. The hard part is securing it right. There are shortcomings with keeping your coins on an exchange, but also with setting up your own self-custody arrangement. Onramp solves for these concerns. Our multi-institution custody solution maximizes security and minimizes counterparty risk, ensuring that your Bitcoin remains securely in your possession, and provides built-in inheritance planning to ensure your family is protected as well. Onramp provides peace of mind for your Bitcoin journey. whether for your whole stack or for part of it as a complement to your existing self-custody setup. For more information, check us out at onrampbitcoin.com.
Well, this this show is called Scarce Assets, and I wonder if you'd be willing to zoom out to the big picture and maybe frame up the last, I don't know, couple centuries or whatever time period you feel is useful, and maybe it's a much shorter time period, but can you take us to the current global competition for scarce assets? Maybe including particular resources, including and especially computing resources.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally the monetary order is downstream of the geopolitical order, and the geopolitical order is a function of state power, and state power is a function of technology capabilities marshaled in service of strategic objectives. And so this is fundamentally science and technology set the framework for what states can or can't do technologically in projecting power defense or defense against each other's power. And so the predicate of state relations is often what is the prevailing technical and scientific paradigm. And so we've seen that unlock new capabilities, whether it's from the agricultural revolution, generating large standing armies that can go out with spears and just hack each other to death, all the way through industrial revolutions where now you can create steamships, now you can create large standing armies with more advanced armaments, and you can sort of do industrial scale warfare. And so this is not a novel observation, but that's kind of the basic foundational predicate for everything else we talk about. And in the 20th century, I think we've seen kind of the relationship between geopolitics and the money system become much more acute. In times past, kind of the systems of global relations had an inherent relationship between money, kings, and kind of the relationship between sort of the capital provision, the merchant class, and different political orders. And those were sort of stretched out in time. So those dynamics did change, but from the perspective of history, it took a lot longer. The 20th century took that same sort of pattern and I think accelerated it. I think we're in an additional period of acceleration. I think the 20th century was a period of particular acceleration, and that has had cascading effects we're still living within, and the formation of a different type of state system that really was forced by competitive pressures in World War II to sort of create vertically integrated state bureaucratic structures to control and marshal continental scale resources and populations to fight and win existential wars. And then also to leverage groundbreaking understanding of the natural sciences to deploy novel weapons and technologies in those state conflicts. And so that birthed kind of the modern security environment we exist in today. So out of World War II, we got, of course, nuclear weapons, but we also got radar. We got kind of the basics of computing and computational systems. We got a whole raft of sort of electrical innovations, proximity fuses. We got a whole bunch of stuff. But those came out of state-directed innovation pipelines, and that really birthed the kind of bureaucratic system that kind of was in its renaissance, essentially, in the post-war era, especially the American version of that. But it forced a kind of, competition around the world for, okay, now we need to create state institutional bureaucracies to sort of fight these resource wars and wars of geopolitical influence. So World War II was a crucible for state institutional creation that we sort of live within today, kind of creation of the modern security state, the Defense Department, sort of the apparatus of government that was sort of formed first out of the sort of the impulse of the New Deal, and then sort of became sort of regularized, and then of course forged in the crucible of World War II is sort of what we live within today. And that really, was kind of the high watermark of kind of this institutional power that was state directed, that was an alignment of military, defense, scientific, technological power. And that was sort of the high watermark of American institutional and global power. And like all institutions, sort of Francis Fukuyama has this sort of characteristic analysis of how institutions are born with the sort of energy of creation, reach a certain maturity, usually within the first or second generation, as they kind of adapt to the, to the environment and grow, and they have a sense of purpose and the sort of a novelty and the sort of energy of the first kind of forebears, and then the second generation, they sort of hand that baton to. And then there's sort of like a characteristic sort of peak and then slow decay as the second and third generations kind of take over that existing system, which has been around for a while, and now kind of what they grew up within is kind of their basic predicate. And then the third and fourth generation is kind of like the Neil Howe sort of fourth turning idea, tend to sort of forget how to maintain the systems that they have inherited, and tend to also approach it more as like a zero-sum competitive dynamic to extract personal benefits out of this legacy system, which once it starts getting into this reflexive feedback loop of decay, the sense of I need to just get what I can out of it before it totally fails starts to dominate kind of the more collective orientation of the initial phase, where it's all about contributing to a higher goal. And I think, unfortunately, I think that's a version of a story you could tell for the American institutional system over the past 80 or 90 years. And it has a dimension that is stretched across not just our geopolitical sort of story, but about and our political system, but about like our monetary system too, right? So there are basic predicates of what sorts of systems you need to support a certain power structure, and the monetary system is a critical component of that. And if you look at history, decisions about changing the monetary regime are fundamentally geopolitical and political decisions. They're not made by the bureaucrats within the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, or the equivalents in other countries, are meant to sort of maintain an existing system. They're meant to operate within very well-established norms and sort of institutional frameworks. Any changes usually to those systems don't come from within; they come from without. And usually they resist those changes until the exogenous pressures sort of reach a tipping point, and then they change pretty dramatically. And so, of course, you had FDR kind of go through this in the 30s, where he was wielding executive power and sort of fixed the gold price. And then Nixon shock in the 70s. And then you could argue that, there were various attempts between the Plaza Accord and the Louvre Accord to one, weaken the dollar and then strengthen the dollar, respectively, that were made essentially by executive mandate. Essentially, the hierarchy of decisions was the White House to the Treasury Department to the Fed, in that order. And I think we're reaching a point in the global system where I think the combination of stresses and institutional decay of legacy systems is going to lead to a similar sort of threshold decision point. And I would expect the sort of historical template to be mirrored in how you would expect the system to adjust going forward. So that's like the U.S. centric version. I think the geopolitical order is sort of a main driver of that. So there's like, in my mind, there's like, the basic dynamic of the global system is essentially that in the post-war era has been, especially post-70s, has been the West, specifically the U.S., as sort of the global military hegemon, is the financial provider of capital and final end user sort of consumer demand for global goods that are the result of production in Southeast Asia, specifically China, that is matched up with sort of raw commodities coming out of OPEC plus. So essentially you have this three-legged stool that's like, financial capital and sort of matrix of sort of military power and territorial or extraterritorial imposition of our legal codes, through sanctions and OFAC sort of regulations on the dollar system. That's like the one key node is the U.S. power. Another key node is sort of OPEC plus, as kind of this loose affiliation of countries that dominate commodity markets, specifically oil. And then China, which has been essentially the main power horse for global manufacturing. And as long as those like three points of the global system were in kind of like a frenemy mode, you kind of got globalization. You got, what we see as like the last 30 or 40 years of sort of economic global order. And I think that system is now in a process of like slow decomposition. And so you can see different examples of like the relations between that on that triangle is like, Russia's sanctions is like taking a major whack between like the U.S. dominated finance capital node and a version and a subset of the OPEC node. You see the technology containment strategy between U.S. and China and sort of this idea of decoupling or de-risking as like a taking an axe and stressing the link between finance capital in the U.S. and its key trading partner and manufacturing supplier in China. On the other hand, you're seeing kind of growing relationships, sort of an improvement of the bond between OPEC plus and China manufacturing centers through things like alternative currency sort of arrangements, innovations with sort of cross-bridge CBDCs, and sort of an increasing security alignment around things like SCO and the BRICS. So that's like, if I zoom out, like there was a global order. It was sort of stable under a certain regime, and now it's getting perturbed pretty strongly. And we don't exactly know how it will continue to evolve, but you should expect potential significant change. So I'll stop there. That was a bit of a rant, but that's kind of my zoomed out view of where we are on a certain perspective.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was a fantastic summary of where we're at, and so thought-provoking. I can't help but find it so interesting that the same problems that, the classic archetype of like, a family making a fortune and then trying to propagate that through generations and having that just natural, inevitable decay of the meaning and skill set necessary to maintain that position is what happens to a country too. You get to that position of power, and then you just inevitably enjoy that position and lose the qualities that were necessary to establish that position in the first place. I want to ask though about so the Changing World Order by Ray Dalio was for me a very helpful entry point into questioning the future trajectory of the global world order, globalism in general, and the sort of stuff you learn about in business school. They sort of project a mentality like the world is going to become more and more unified, and then the Changing World Order was kind of the first really polished and well-respected finance name that I was aware of, really challenging and questioning that. But it felt like in Ray Dalio's thesis, the sort of implied takeaway was that the U.S. is going through this natural decay as, you're the dominant reserve currency for 100 years, and then inevitably a rising power takes your place. And the implied takeaway for me, at least, was that China was the ascendant world power going forward. But it felt wrong. It still feels wrong to me because it feels to me, with the Bitcoin lens, like the internet is that rising power that can be, the new place that people turn to for trust in a currency. What are your thoughts on the Changing World Order thesis, ideas? What does Ray Dalio get right or wrong? Very curious.
Yeah, I've certainly respected and have gained a lot from reading his analysis, and I think he does a good historical review, and I think he's making a conservative projection, essentially just to saying, holding all else equal, this is the past pattern. We should see indicators of that past pattern repeating itself, and so I'm just going to sort of follow the trends lines that history tells me are should be expected. I think there's like, quote unquote, like this time isn't different, but this time is different. Like fundamentally, technology has changed civilization, and we are becoming a digital civilization, and increasingly state power is mediated through digital systems. In fact, you could argue most of the state competition we see is happening sort of through, over, and on and against essentially each other's digital networks, right? So whether it's subsea cables, space transmission, downlinks to the Arctic, whether it's digital currencies, whether it's AI computing, clusters, this is sort of the frontier of state competition. And like power in a digital society is essentially network power. And network power has two different kinds. You have choke point and surveillance power. So like the equivalent in financial networks is, choke point is like OFAC. You get to block and sort of excise, participants out of a network. And that gives you a lot of power if you are the dominant, if you control most of the nodes in that network. And if you control most of the nodes in the network, or you can influence most of the nodes in the network to follow your rules, that gives you a lot of surveillance power. So you can get Bank Secrecy Act reports out of every financial institution in the world. You can impose your extraterritorial sanctions, through those relationships, through the dollar clearing system, and so you get an immense amount of power. So the U.S. still has an immense amount of power that comes from just having legacy dominance of these existing networks. And China is trying to do two things. One is they're trying to mitigate how much exposure they have, immediately to being coerced by that legacy system, because they don't have an equivalent global hierarchical, correspondent banking system that the United States has sort of organically supported the development of over the past 80 years. And so they're trying to essentially block how much they can be coerced while trying to basically create their alternative sort of rails as like a failover backup. But that's in the financial space where like the U.S.'s legacy is still dominant, and China essentially is trying to sort of carve out some autonomy while putting in backup plans. In trade and sort of manufacturing, China is already dominant. So China is by far the largest trading partner for most countries in the world. They're climbing the value chain pretty aggressively, and it's triggering kind of panic in the West, whether it's EVs, photovoltaics, 5G, et cetera. And I see my analysis of kind of the overall dynamic here is sort of a network competition playing out over all these different types of networks that are all sort of interrelated. And there's like a value system piece of it that's built in the sense that China's value proposition and their version of kind of digital technological governance is, we need your resources, you need our capital and our technology, and this is the deal. We'll give you essentially Huawei 5G, we'll give you CTE surveillance, we'll give you all of our state-owned enterprise and construction capacity, and we'll sort of help you develop your economies, become more digitally native. But it'll be on sort of our platform, right? And that will sort of help keep your regime in power, and will help ensure that those resource deals and those geopolitical deals are secured. So I think that is sort of the dynamic playing out, is like a competition over global influence that's over and through these digital networks. And I think it's not necessarily the same old story of systems just inevitably collapse because of some historical projection. His main focus is on debt. And so just to like zoom in on that is like, okay, some folks look at the US debt load as essentially an existential burden for the United States. And I think it is a critical burden. But, there are sort of levers that the hegemon still has. And so you would expect that not to just go down quietly, right? And an important lever is that in a world that's increasingly geopolitically risky, where conflict, especially great power conflict, looks like it's creeping up in terms of the probabilities, then a whole host of states that are in the periphery of, you might call like the dollar imperium, their demand for security protection goes up, right? And the United States, as the potential provider of that security protection, can do a deal, which is we will provide more security protection, but you have to pay, right? It's a traditional kind of old style sort of racketeering, right? And whether it's Trump going over to NATO and bullying them into paying up more, or whether it's doing these deals with Japan and the Philippines, South Korea, et cetera. You could imagine an arrangement which is the world divides into sort of clubs and fences, and the United States sort of in its while it still has some legacy power in the global system, uses those reserves of power to essentially enforce a security zone, gates the security zone with tariffs, and then forces members of that security zone to essentially pay up. And how could they pay up? Well, if you look at historical practice, whether it's FDR or Nixon, usually do that via some form of financial repression, right? And it's never quite the same, but it's usually the same in effect. And the same effect, go back to FDR, essentially is we're effectively going to either seize or devalue your gold your gold holdings, your gold reserves, which we were doing then consistently, essentially post-war, until it became untenable. And then Nixon essentially said, okay, we're just going to flip the switch, and we're going to now go to floating exchange rates. So that was effectively a devaluation, right? It was a financial oppression, especially of kind of our friends and allies, critically. But they couldn't really do a whole lot because, it was this Cold War bloc-based, division of security zones, and they were in our zone. And so they could protest, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we have the nukes, we have the aircraft carriers, et cetera. So that's how we were able to enforce that essentially reset of the sort of the fiscal position of the U.S. government as the sort of core of this dollar imperial system. So the equivalent today would not be like you can imagine varieties of it. You can imagine instead of devaluing the gold content of people's reserves, is like increasing the duration content of their FX reserves. So force them to just buy longer dated treasuries. Everyone is basically now funding very short term, whether it's repos or FX swap markets or the foreign repo pool, very short term funding, bills markets, et cetera. And that's not exactly expressing a whole lot of confidence in the long-term fiscal and military strategic hegemony of the United States. So you could say, we're going to force you to provide a vote of confidence, which is you're going to swap those for century bonds or longer dated treasuries, and we'll let you swap them at the FX at the sort of the FIMA sort of repo facility at the Fed, at par, just like the BTFP kind of facility. So in extremis, if you need access to dollar liquidity, you can take those century bonds, you can pledge them at the Fed and get dollar liquidity. And that just sort of reinforces sort of the network power of the Fed and the dollar system, and it further sort of subjugates essentially monetarily sort of the periphery. So this is why I think this story that you tell of like simple curves of like the dollar debt loads are unsustainable, and then there'll be a bond revolt, and that the U.S. government will just be like, oh, there's a bond revolt, I guess we're not the hegemon anymore. It's like, that's not the story that I would expect as a baseline. There is going to be like a whole bunch of Alamos, right, that are going to be said like, this is the last line, and there'll be extreme sort of choices imposed on our friends and allies that we will essentially look to financially repress and geopolitically coerce to keep the system going. And so that's my baseline, right? That doesn't mean that everything just the wheels fall off. But it means that as we were essentially fighting, but we are fighting a major competition with China, at least from the perspective of DC policy elites, that there's a certain narrative that has taken hold, and it's got elements of truth to it, which is like all the bad things that have happened in the past 30 years, whether it's a deindustrialization, the sort of atrophy of our defense industrial base, the fentanyl ravaging of the working class, deaths of despair, the political polarization, all of this sort of has been a cause of neoliberal elites selling out the country to China, essentially adopting this, Gordon Gekko, greed and globalization is good 2.0 type idea, and kind of got, rich off of this recycling system, taking dollar surpluses from China and OPEC and then putting it into fancy assets and Manhattan real estate, and they're getting rich, and then the middle working class gets hosed. There's some truth to that. But at the same time, it's sort of, it's like, well, this is kind of you don't just flip a switch and change the basic structure of the global economic system. Like China actually has built an industrial base that's extremely effective. And the United States is working from a position of relative weakness when it comes to that industrial capacity. And instead, we're sort of, I think, living in a bit of a fantasy world where we think building some more chip fabrications in Ohio is going to somehow magically solve this problem. It's great for politicians. Everyone gets to say, oh, we're building these, fancy data centers. It's tech jobs. But again, it's not that many jobs. And once the facility's built, it's like a few high skilled workers that are going to be replaced by robots in a few years anyways. So it's like, for me, it's a version of magical thinking. So like the biggest threat to the West, and I'll wrap this part up. The biggest threat to the West isn't our debt load. It is our magical thinking. It's the fact that we don't really think certain things are problems, and I think it's a bit political, and I try to be completely agnostic. I'm just trying to be an analytic observer, but like the whole issue with Biden's performance at the debate was a version of this magical thinking coming to roost. Even close folks very close to the president, who were like staunch allies of him, had a bit of like cognitive shock at the fact that they had been laboring under an illusion of the apparent competence and coherence of national strategic policymaking in the executive office. And it was a bit of like this isn't just a right-wing Republican talking point, right? This is like a statement of fact. And it's kind of hard to kind of come to grips with that, right? It's like the world is a certain way, and you telling a certain narrative. And we're so good at fighting information wars with each other that we think everything is information war, when there are actual material constraints and facts in the world that you have to eventually confront. And the unfortunate problem I think we have in the West is we're really skilled at telling narratives, and we're like really good expert PR, narrative shapers. And when you have a lot of endogenous power, you can kind of coast on that, and you can sort of just invest a lot of your elite cognitive capacity in constructing really sophisticated narratives. But when the sort of base of actual hard institutional legitimacy and material power starts to erode, and all you're good at is essentially spinning tails and stories for each other, then you have this sort of roadrunner moment when all of a sudden you realize, this actually isn't a stable foundation. And that's unfortunately the biggest risk I see. Is not that, and this could have cascading impacts to the debt markets, is like if folks feel that, the basic structure of American power is effectively hollow, then there could be, instability. But yeah, that to me is the biggest risk. Isn't like the debt load per se, but is like the narrative frame that we've constructed for ourselves as now lagging the material reality. And you need to always be in alignment with reality, whether it's good or bad. You just need to accept it and then come up with a plan.
Yeah, it does strikes me in the little analysis I've done on this of there are levers that could be pulled, austerity and the like, but we have just no political will, no desire as an electorate to face that reality, and instead we come up with magical thinking to just kick the can, and then the national debt becomes a real problem if you're just not going to address it with reality.
Well, let's talk about the reality. I want to get back to your concept of military power and the U.S. power umbrella over Europe, obviously, but other segments of the world. And I know this is near and dear to your professional experience. Let's talk about cybernetics, and let's talk about command and control, and let's talk about nodes and networks. When you look at the U.S. military budget, and you look at, let's say big ships and aircraft and, physical things that can deliver mayhem. How do you think about how that budget is allocated as compared to cybersecurity in general, or as compared to elements of information technology? Any way you want to go with that?
I mean, this is, I think, a fundamental shift in how American policymakers think about security. I mean, we're a continental island, and that has shaped a lot of our sort of our mental models of security and defense, also our sense of national identity and security, that, we have relatively friendly neighbors ever since, a few 18th century or 19th century wars with Mexico and kind of just to sort of clear the table. But once we establish kind of, the continental sort of hegemonic framework for our security model, then we're riding high. I mean, we had, then a sense of how we could essentially leverage the fact that we're both a Pacific and Atlantic power to project naval power globally, dominate maritime and commercial trade networks. And that was sort of we're both that was the story of the 20th century. We kind of just took over the world, basically. And that gave us a sense of domestic invulnerability. No one could plausibly invade the United States. No one was ever going to take over or invade us, unlike other countries, which have to worry about armored divisions on their border, and that it's an acute threat that has to frame their whole approach to security. And this is not a novel observation, but of course, cybersecurity, the fact we became digitally connected civilization, our society then was exposed to threats from other actors globally distributed in a way that that those physical borders really were rendered moot. And that has taken a while to sort of shift the overall strategic mindset in the United States. And it has come in two different directions. One is ransomware has really dramatically shifted the threat landscape for private companies, and started to become a point where private companies are essentially kind of normally you exist within a territory of a sovereign, state, and they provide, certain common goods. And one of those is collective security, that we don't just, let anyone just come in and rob you, blind. We don't just we enforce some basic rules of law and a security order around the private sector so they can do business, right? You're sort of saying in cyberspace, there's a version of piracy emerge that's extremely lucrative, and that is sort of becoming strategically important, especially in certain targets like, say, Colonial Pipeline or Change Healthcare, where now we realize there are certain private entities that are critical infrastructure for society. And it doesn't require China or Russia hacking them. It can just be a bunch of 18-year-old kids in Belarus that, pick the right target at the right time and take down a provider that's critically important to an entire sector of the economy. And then everyone loses their minds. It seems like every week now there's a version of this, whether it's in the energy sector, in the health sector, pharmaceuticals, in even car dealerships were like in chaos a few weeks ago because a critical company that provides all the software to all these car dealerships, got ransomware. So we're sort of waking up to the fact that there's the basic shift in the security paradigm for private enterprises that are essentially just bundles of SaaS applications in the cloud, and they're the security provider for their business is no longer the state; it's essentially that cloud provider, whether it's Microsoft or Google, whoever, or a bunch of other third parties. And so now they really rely more on the security practices and obligations or responsibilities of these private sort of tech conglomerates, which are not great, right? Microsoft essentially sells security as an upsell. So you're kind of on your own, especially if you're a small company or even a medium-sized business. But the U.S. government has faced a similar version of this own problem, but against larger scale actors, right? So it's ransomware has hit some federal agencies, but really the major threat that keeps the government up at night. And this is to your point question about balance of how much we spend on hard physical assets like aircraft carriers, which are $13 billion a pop, or multi-billion-dollar spy satellites, is that the cost differential for strategic platforms is dramatically changed, right? And so this is manifested both in the hard physical domain, like drones, for example, where the Houthis can build a $15,000-$20,000 drone and can block a major global choke point for maritime trade and essentially force for months the rerouting of massive trade volumes, around the Horn of Africa. That doesn't require, anything more than a bit of support from Iran in terms of manufacturing, and then using Chinese components, which can give you really effective, essentially precision-guided missiles. And that is not something that we baked into our calculations when we were building these fleets of destroyers and carriers, 20, 30 years ago. And in cyber, it's the same thing where it's, there's been, this has been reported now as a group that's affiliated with the People's Liberation Army, their Eastern Theater Command called Volt Typhoon, which is embedded itself in American critical infrastructure networks, both overseas in Guam and Hawaii, but also in the continental United States. And they're looking in, they're already embedded in critical infrastructure networks, so telecommunications, ports, certain energy transmission systems, as well as water systems. And so we now are waking up to this moment of okay, are the systems upon which we rely on to ensure civil order, economic functioning, even our military mobilization and readiness, can be sort of held at risk at a distance from an adversary, purely essentially using very clever tricks to get in, and it's not an easy solution to get them out. And that is a different form of security environment than you had throughout the Cold War, where it was basically the missile counterforce balance, and hard power of okay, how much air defense do they have? Can we knock it out? Could we go in there and take that territory? Now it's a much more dynamic regime of coercion in advance of conflict. Because the whole premise of these actions by, for example, this group, Volt Typhoon, isn't really to win a war when we're fighting it. It's to deter us from escalating our involvement in a conflict, say in Taiwan, because our domestic political decisions will focus on keeping order here, and it will change the calculation of leadership when everyone is freaking out about water and power, et cetera, in various urban environments, and not stuff halfway around the world in Taiwan. And so that is a dramatic shift. You've seen this in space as well, right? I mentioned the multi-billion-dollar super spy satellites. Well, you can get similar capabilities for much cheaper now, and they're not as vulnerable targets. Like a multi-billion-dollar platform we put into orbit, it's vulnerable up there, right? And so if instead you can put many different low-cost, highly effective capabilities that are much more what they call attritable, then that's a big shift the United States government is trying to move to. But I agree, it's back to our point about magical thinking. The Defense Department has put about $1 billion towards something called the Replicator Initiative, and this has been much ballyhooed, big strategic pivot in how we think about fighting wars, much more about mass quantities of low cost, relatively effective autonomous systems. And how do we
Swarms.
just churn these out? Swarms, right? Undersea smart mines, swarm-based drone systems for ISR as well as precision strike, satellite-based swarms, self-healing mesh communications networks, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it looks really good on a PowerPoint slide, right? But when we actually turn to our defense industrial base and we say, oh, can you build 100,000 of these things? They laugh in your face. And they say, okay, like you need to pony up upfront capital costs of X amount, and then maybe I can churn this out. And by the way, I can't guarantee you that I can source all those electronic, chips and critical, just sort of, basic components from anywhere that isn't China. So I can do is really good. Like the United States is really good at creating exquisite, top of the end, super spooky capabilities that no one else on the planet knows about. But again, how many do we have? And are those going to be things that are going to be winning, a fight that could be like, a matter of political will and industrial capacity? Whereas China that's all that they're doing, focus on is just how to churn out hundreds of thousands of these units, and they have a whole industrial ecosystem to turn to do that. And that, again, magical thinking is like, oh, we'll write a check, we'll create a big program, and we'll just rely on the competence of these industrial players and the bureaucracies in the Pentagon to kind of like make it happen. But like the foundation upon which that worked is like doesn't exist anymore. Like we had the Ford and GMs, we had the industrial capacity before World War II that we could convert into making tanks and planes. We don't have that like latent capacity to convert now. And so there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of like, yeah, we should do this. And there's some, promising initial attempts, but is it sufficient to meet this, to cash the check that we're writing? I don't know. I think I need to see more than I've seen today.
Does your Bitcoin custody setup keep you up at night? Maybe you still have coins sitting on an exchange worried about hackers. Or maybe you've set up your own self-custody but don't feel safe with your Bitcoin savings stashed on a little plastic device in your desk drawer. Gain peace of mind with Onramp and our multi-institution custody solution. Here's how it works. Onramp creates a dedicated multi-sig vault just for you. 3 separate institutions each hold a key. Onramp, BitGo, and CoinCover. But none can move funds unilaterally. Instead, only you have control over your coins. With Onramp's multi-institution custody, you'll sleep better at night knowing your Bitcoin is stored with best-in-class security on-chain with fault-tolerant multi-sig. If you believe your Bitcoin is going to be worth a lot someday, don't jeopardize that future by exposing your coins to hackers on exchanges, $5 wrench attacks in the real world, or perhaps most importantly, the risk that you might screw something up with a highly technical self-custody setup. Onramp's multi-institution custody eliminates single points of failure, reduces your personal attack surface and technical burden, and provides access to financial services that allow you to confidently secure your Bitcoin, including inheritance planning, insurance-backed warranties for all balances and transactions, low-cost trading, and more. Bitcoin is a once-in-a-species asset. Secure it right. Learn more at onrampbitcoin.com.
It's hard to replicate, an industrial base like Shenzhen, right, within the United States after there's been all this offshoring of that industrial capacity. We really are in a different world today. Well, there's a couple of directions I want to go with here. I want to return to your comment about Microsoft. One of my sort of mental models economically for Microsoft is it's a business that runs a monopoly, that extracts monopoly rents in terms of revenue, while offboarding all the liability associated with insecurity. And so no wonder it's a wonderful business, right? No wonder it's one of the most profitable businesses in history. Now, of course, it's new. The cloud dynamic is that's a little bit of a different business, and it changes the model. But one of the things I always loved about Bitcoin was that it actually privatized the cost of insecurity, right? For the first time ever. Companies that were running insecure software actually had a price potentially associated with it. Now, I don't know where that ends up from a policy perspective. I sometimes imagine that the only real solution is that most or all critical infrastructure at least on the private side, needs to run on open source software just because it'll maybe actually be secure. That might be ambitious or unrealistic. Do you have any thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and certainly this is close to what I do day to day. Is when you think about what a private company is, as like the basic systems that run a company, it has fundamentally changed the last 15 or 20 years. It used to be you would have servers in-house run quote on-prem, maintained by your own in-house IT department, and responsible for securing essentially that like intranet. And it was like kind of a walled garden, and it was really focused on security in that model was about ensuring that like you could kind of monitor the boundary of that enterprise network, and it was firewalls and it was authentication systems and encryption, et cetera. What has dramatically shifted in the last 10 or 20 years, really in the last 10 years, has been the shift to the cloud, right? And increasingly what the company is, in terms of the data, the systems, the process, the tools, but the administrative functions are essentially provided by third parties, SaaS applications, whether it's Slack or your major enterprise sort of hosting provider, mostly Microsoft or Google Cloud or AWS, et cetera. And so a company is just kind of a bundle of SaaS applications with a certain tax registration and globally distributed employees that can log in to perform their different functions. And so security, you think about securing that sort of thing, the security model for that sort of company is very complicated now because there's been a proliferation of more complex, technical stacks. Kind of the legacy stack is still sometimes mixed in with kind of this cloud stack. We haven't shifted to like a new model, but you can imagine imagine that essentially if the trend continues, you can see most companies could look like essentially, they're kind of like serfs in like a digital sort of feudal system, right? Like their whole data just exists and all the services exist hosted on, say, a single provider, say Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure, could be like hedged between multiple clouds, but usually it's like a handful of them. And so your security model is essentially their security model, right? They have all your data. Your operational systems are dependent on their functioning cloud infrastructure. Your customers' data is hosted on their servers. And so the security model for a private company now is essentially contingent on the security practices of these big tech conglomerates. And so, there's certain things individual companies still are responsible for, like provisioning access to their employees, ensuring they have multi-factor authentication. They often develop a whole bunch of their own business applications. They got to make sure that those applications are secure, the whole sort of DevSecOps stuff. And of course, AI is changing that as well. So it's not like, it's still a very mixed bag. But I would say to your point, like private companies do not work like an economic super efficient machine, right? Sort of the Gaussian analysis of like, there's a price signal from ransomware, and therefore that price signal will translate into, a certain security response. I think you're seeing that, but it's not necessarily sufficient, right? So like the threat of ransomware has forced companies to raise the profile of security considerations, up. And so budgets have also gone up to a certain extent, but it's also kind of like human beings are very much, especially corporate CEOs and senior, sort of chief financial officers, security is a cost center, right? The rest of the company provides revenue. And so if you ever hit a speed bump, you're coming up on quarter end and you're looking ways to save money, cost centers always take the hit first. And so you see security spend kind of comes in these peaks and troughs, and it's very sector specific, where like if there's a very high profile event that hits a certain sector, and it looks like maybe the feds are going to start to regulate it, like for example, in healthcare, there's a whole push now after the Change Healthcare stuff to potentially pass like mandatory security requirements. And of course, the health sector is very resistant to that because it would force them to spend more than they want to spend, often at their own collective expense. So this is the problem of like human beings is like, we tend to, unless we have there's like a principal agent problem here. It's just like the corporate CEOs get judged on on financial performance and sort of equity returns, and their stock and their pay packages are directly related to that. And so if there's like this turkey problem of like, yeah, they could get hit by ransomware, but if they just do enough to look like they did the right things, then they still get hit, they kind of covered their ass, right? So there's a big problem of how to a lot of conversations I have is like how to translate not just cyber risk but geopolitical risk, which are to a certain extent like unquantifiable. There's been some attempts to sort of quantify cyber risk, but in my perspective, they're just, they're only usually applicable in like very narrow domains. And even then they're not that great. Like cyber insurance is like not a very effective market at the moment. And that's just like a proof of kind of this, they haven't been able to price that risk effectively, right? Usually if you can price the risk, you should be able to buy an insurance product to mitigate it. And there's not great. The cyber insurance market is just not very effective at the moment. So that was just so we're kind of in not a great spot when it comes to cybersecurity in the modern enterprise. And it's compounded by the fact that you're seeing the financial incentives, as Bitcoin goes up, right? The financial incentives for ransom actors goes up as well. And you're increasingly seeing some sophisticated threat actors, like in the nation state level, kind of masquerade as ransomware crews, which is very clever. In fact, we just put out a report on this of a Chinese group that was sort of, making themselves look like in conducting ransomware attacks. Because if you just want to steal some stuff,
it used to be that government hackers were a cost center for governments, but now that they can get paid, they can make Bitcoin, right?
Well, I mean, ransomware. North Korea's Lazarus group, which is essentially their cyber element of their military intelligence wing of the party, is full-time cyber criminals. And they're very effective at not just hacking and stealing weakly coded DeFi protocols and cross-bridge protocols, but actually infiltrating employees into these protocols as programmers, as developers. And then once they get to a certain size, they get access to the keys, and they just poof, they're ours now. Or they just build in vulnerabilities that some other unit exploits. So we're seeing it's kind of this Cryptonomicon, kind of system. I don't see it reaching like a healthy equilibrium at any point soon. It's kind of an arms race between offense and defense. And I think at the end of the day, you're going to see something like if the monopoly security provider can't effectively defend private companies, private companies are going to eventually kind of defend themselves. And this idea of private companies hacking back is technically against the law, but at a certain point, I can imagine the norms shift enough that that's what happens. Or certain U.S. policymakers make a decision that we're going to impose cost on certain groups that cross a red line. And we've drone strike terrorists. We haven't drone striked any ransomware crews. But I don't know. I'm not advocating as a policy, but I could see that you could see us on a trajectory where that gets considered. This is a new dynamic, and the boundary lines between the public and private sector are dramatically shifting. And one other key point on Microsoft, back to the point of digital sovereignty and the changing nature of warfare. So in the early weeks of the Ukraine conflict, when Russia came in, is Ukrainian government was worried about their basic government services and data, which was locally hosted. And so Microsoft offered and did essentially redeploy all of those services to their Azure infrastructure in the UK, free of charge. It's like a few $100 million worth of digital services equivalent. And so that's like a digital government in exile, right? It's a concept we didn't really have before, where all of the government records and services, whether it's tax records, draft records, government services of all kinds, were essentially being hosted out of the country by a private company. And this idea of national sovereignty starts to become more sort of complicated, right? It's okay, a sovereign government is relying on essentially the goodwill of a private company to protect its basic functioning as a state. And that then that's not a concept that existed 30 years ago. And so I think you're seeing that power dynamic play out, and Microsoft is a key example of this, where doing these arrangements around the world, you can sort of model Microsoft as a quasi-sovereign entity that has its own strategic objectives, which is build more data centers, more places to suck in more data to just digitally colonize as much of the digital territory as possible. That's its objective. Its objective isn't to do good things for America or do good things for China or do good things for the Emirates. It's to like grow more data centers, suck in more data, and like colonize more of the digital territory and have more companies and governments essentially pay rent on its digital land, right? If that's the metaphor. And so then it has this incentive to go in all these places and do deals that like G42 in the Emirates and now doing this sort of data center build out in Kenya that from one perspective look like, oh, this is great. This is now an American tech company, colonizing this digital, land, and not a Chinese company. It's not Alibaba Cloud, et cetera, or there's no Huawei, towers there. It's all going to be, Microsoft and OpenAI, data centers and AI. But the other perspective, it's like, well, Microsoft is a fair weather company. Like they are responsible for their shareholders. And at the end of the day, we don't have a whole lot of coercive influence over Microsoft. In fact, a government, like a new government board called the Cyber Safety Review Board, totally ripped into Microsoft like a month or two ago because it was their basic security failures that led to the pretty deep compromise of U.S. government, agencies. And, was like China and Russia kind of leveraging Microsoft's poor security practices. And because, they didn't have the incentive to prioritize that, and it created a big PR thing. But at the end of the day, like the U.S. government, can sort of use the bully pulpit and maybe confine them. But we're in this new world where these private big tech companies do have essentially almost quasi-sovereign power. And to your point about Bitcoin, I think that's where it's really fascinating because there's, not too many like novel institutions that are globally, distributed that have a sort of a self-sustaining endogenous stability to them. But they're not, like these existing systems of kind of neo-feudal digital capitalism, right? They're kind of a much more different form of system. And I think the implications of that, should be modeled into how you think about, the development of these digital societies and whether you're going to swing towards this techno-authoritarian, neo-digital feudal model, or whether they're going to have a more decentralized, liberal, traditional, sort of small d democratic sort of political and economic system that's now digitally mediated. And that's I think those are going to be the battle lines for, the next decade or two.
Wow, so much embedded in there. I always, in that vein, as it relates to corporate sovereignty, Matt, I sometimes think about the AI boom, and I think about owning equity in, I don't know, NVIDIA or Google or Microsoft or whoever one of these AI plays is. And I think to myself, what does that mean exactly? Like, how do I feel about my status as a minority shareholder in an entity that may already, or at least in the near future, possess so much power that it may somewhat exist outside the classical boundaries of property rights that investors, have come to depend on, at least in the United States, over the last few centuries. Like what does that look like? Do you have any thoughts? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, the lesson of history is that the plebs always get hosed, right? The masses are always just the exploited, physical labor or grunts for the meat machine on the front. So like lesson of history is that most systems of power don't care what you think, Andy. Most systems of power run over you like a bug underneath the tire, right? It's like only in like a sort of a relatively recent window of human history have there been systems of government where the systems of power have to essentially be accountable and checked by, the median voter. And I think the conditions that enabled such political conditions to obtain were coincidence that was kind of lucky, right? It was kind of, coincidence of the fact that it was a relatively liberal English, parliamentary system that discovered coal and became like an industrial powerhouse for global trade, and then imposed their common law norms and English language around the world, and then colonized America, which had this massive abundance, kind of a one-shot, massive, natural resource kind of like, treasure house that could, import that system of democratic rule and common law, adapt it for the frontier, democratic ethos, and created created America. Like those were like contingent historical kind of like lucky strikes. And, I think, I'm not like, a pessimist. I'm not an optimist. I'm sort of just like there's historical determining conditions about like what political conditions are possible under certain economic and technological conditions. And unfortunately, I think we could be heading to an environment where, this. I don't believe this fully, but you could tell a good argument that, for example, like the Goss plan of the Soviets, was practically infeasible from the same sort of like Hayekian knowledge argument that you just can't centrally plan a complex economy. There's a certain strain of technocratic belief that actually with AI, you can do two things. One, you can do more complex, real-time analysis of the economy. In fact, the Bank of International Settlements, this is like one of their main policy sort of tool programs is to like how to do like quote unquote nowcasting with AI to actually try to see the economy in real time and try to do these fine-tuned adjustments to steer and manage the economy. That's how I view it. But the other hand, there's another subset of stakeholders that don't say this publicly, but they also believe AI is really good. Okay, if there's too many preferences, there's too many diverse sets of beliefs and attitudes in society, we just need to like manage that diversity down to a controllable system. And so you can use AI not just to calculate preferences and wages and do the sort of Goss plan light version, but you can like take the extraneous variables that otherwise would be too complex for the AI to manage. You can just use AI to like steer them away, to suppress them away. And when everyone's beliefs and attitudes are technologically mediated and therefore manipulatable, you could see yourself drifting into sort of a techno-authoritarian AI Goss plan. And there's a lot of folks, I think, in that elite system that believe that's like a desirable course of action. And that would, potentially lead to more safe, more stable economic systems, but would eventually be, an erosion of what we would think of as like individual liberty and, democratic legitimacy. So that is like a big fear that I have is that we're sort of in this slow motion, path of least resistance just to give more control up to these systems, even if they're not that good, but they form a shelling point, right, for sort of elite governance. That okay, we all just agree that this is the system we're gonna follow because it makes everything easier for us to manage. I don't think it's actually going to work, but I think they could try. And so, this is where Bitcoin is potentially very important politically in that it provides essentially a refuge, right? Because I think Europe, certainly is going along this path where they're under so much stress of fragmentation and geopolitical economic stress that the need to try to like contain things is going to, has incentives to centralize and therefore, suppress diversity of thought, diversity of economic decision making. And usually when you're in a crisis, whether it's war or something approaching war, you tend to see things like capital controls, credit rationing, financial repression, censorship, etc. And so if the world, the power structure thinks that it's in a crisis, which it is, you would expect that to be the trend line. That's just what history tells me.
Heavy,
Sorry, that was
heavy stuff.
No, of course the technocratic central planning bordering on communist, top-down directive control. It does feel like it will be tried because has been the dream in many circles for the last century. So in all this, Matt, you've brought so much nuance and like considered thought to both the trajectory of the future trajectory of like national security and cybersecurity. And then I'm very curious to tease out, like, how do you think about Bitcoin and its role in the trajectory into the future? Specifically, how you think differently from the rest of us Bitcoiners who haven't layered in all these considered nuances about, the complexity of how all these different levers that the U.S. will pull with regard to the national debt and so on.
So I think for one, nothing is like historically inevitable. And if I look at history, I see a lot of like contingent decisions made by like certain individuals, like presidents actually matter, right? So like who makes it just like, Nixon with like, I think Kissinger wasn't there, but it was his Treasury Secretary. It was Paul Volcker. It was like one other guy at like Camp David in like 3 days. And they kind of just decided they were going to do, the Nixon shock. right? That there was probably like there was build up to that. There was like I think they were triangulating around a big change. There was like a few guys went to a place, had some decisions, and it was like boom, we're going to announce it, and then everyone's going to like be in a different world. And so I sort of think about Bitcoin in that way, which is, it's naturally evolving, but the legacy system is still subject to like a handful of individual decision makers, whether it's the White House decision makers, ECB, President Xi, et cetera. And so I think sometimes Bitcoiners, think too much about sort of the inevitable, just sort of trend line, having cycle driven peaks and valleys in the price action as just, okay, it is the unstoppable force, and it will sort of sweep away the legacy system. It's almost like this, it's kind of like a religious fervor, right? It's just, you need that to like have the movement spark itself. And there's a sense of like hyper optimism that you have to have, right, to a certain extent, as being a part of any sort of political movement. I think Bitcoin, subsets of Bitcoin are like a political movement in that respect. But I think, as a pure realist, is like there's legacy institutions, and some parts of those legacy institutions are going to react very hostilely or very, pragmatically to this emerging trend. And I think it's very hard to predict. But like, for example, just to make this very practical, like Trump hosting whatever it was, the 10 or 15 Bitcoin mining CEOs and a few other folks, David Bailey, kind of, the ringleader of that posse down in Mar-a-Lago. So like, big monetary shifts happen in, usually like retreats or like palaces, the Versailles or the Louvre or, even Bretton Woods,
Jekyll Island.
Yeah, Jekyll Island, they're on a yacht, so it's usually like you get a small bunch of rich people or elites or something, you put them into like a fancy building and they come up with like a summit or an accord or whatever, right? And then they change. And at least what I heard from that meeting is that there's some wild conversations happening about the potential for Bitcoin in a Trump administration. Now, I think some of that is just like, throw it against the wall, see what sticks, right? Or just you have an opportunity to shift the Overton window so dramatically. So you just want to blow the Overton window as far out as possible. And then knowing that it's eventually going to snap back, but it's going to snap back to a place that's like fundamentally shifted from where it is today. So there's probably some tactical considerations about, some of those ideas. But I think not enough thought goes into it's sort of like there's a risk of Bitcoiners like being like the dog that caught the car, right? Which is like we were so much always like thinking, oh, nation state adoption is almost here, nation state adoption is almost here, central banks are going to buy it, Middle East is going to buy it, China's going to buy it, it's going to be this geopolitical arms race, and then like our bags are going to be just like add zeros. And I think not much thought is going into like what actually happens when that happens, right? There's just because I think it's been painted for so many years as like this somewhat far off, but not too far off, kind of somewhat utopian vision of like Bitcoin making it, right? And coming out of the wilderness of being somewhat of a fringe, taboo, somewhat derided subclass. And there's a resentment built up, and it's like there's a desire to like have that one big, aha, told you so, I was right, you're wrong, bend the knee, yada, yada, yada. And that's all fine. But that's a psychological, it's not an analytical reaction. An analytical reaction.
Come on, none of us have ever felt this way, Matt. Nobody listening to this show has ever had these thoughts.
I mean, it's completely natural and fair to a certain extent. But I think it matters exactly how that happens. Like there's a path dependency. This is why I've argued for a while now that the United States should have a Bitcoin strategy, right? It doesn't mean it doesn't mean I've determined what that strategy should be. It just means we should have one, right? It's like there should be a considered national effort, broad, spanning both the Treasury Department and traditional kind of economic policy, but as well as national security decision makers and policy sort of analysts from the defense and intelligence communities as well, to say, okay, let's paint a scenario where Bitcoin, say, does monetize to the level of gold, which is maybe not my baseline scenario, but it's certainly a reasonable scenario for say this decade. I don't know what percentage, whatever percentage you ascribe to that is probably what price you think, your break even should be. You want to be buying up to that point. But I see zero national policy decision making or strategy planning for that type of scenario. But that would be a very disruptive monetary shakeup, geopolitical shakeup. And it would mean that likely Bitcoin has been incorporated into the sovereign reserves of many different countries, if not the United States, potentially many different Gulf powers, maybe South Asian countries, maybe Singapore, maybe China, etc. So how that happens, whether it's the United States that leads, that sort of does it in a deliberative fashion, I think is a very positive end result for both U.S. national security, Bitcoiners, as well as the sort of the fiscal position of the United States, if we're going to be going to a more unstable kind of monetary environment. If it ends up being the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Chinese, then it's probably not great for the United States, right? And so I have to be like an analyst to be like, well, the Bitcoin could be at the same price, but the geopolitical implications, the national security implications could be very different depending on how that happens. And I think Bitcoiners are so much of just like, let's get to that level, let's just have it happen, that they're not thinking about, okay, what's the best possible path to get to that level, right? And not just be like, well, our only objective is to get to that level, and therefore whatever is the quickest path to get there is what we should choose. So I think there's people can have different views of that. My view is sometimes it's better to maybe take a slightly slower path that's deliberative and planned to maximize, I think, the advantages of the West than necessarily the quickest path that might also, make you rich, but also could accrue power and influence to, say, dictators in the Middle East that I would prefer not to be relatively empowered, or to China, for example. And so that's like a philosophical, political attitude. So people can disagree with that, certainly. But I think that's a conversation that isn't happening. It's just, okay, whatever gets us there, right? And there's also a sense of, I think some folks have this view of, well, how you get there is by having this kind of arms race. So how you get here is by essentially, memeing it into existence, like having Trump go on stump speeches and talk about Bitcoin very, very positively, and then whisper that actually he's gonna accumulate Bitcoin in national reserves. He's gonna order the Fed to buy it. He's gonna do a bunch of stuff would be, from our perspective now, look, like, wow, like that's like a step change in terms of national policy. But if he says that, well, then that has to send different signals that aren't being sent or hadn't been sent before to the Chinese authorities, to the Gulf. And that could, essentially meme this kind of geopolitical arms race to buy Bitcoin into existence, which, could be successful. But it's like, okay, if your plan is just to like spark that fire, that's great. But then the global system is extremely complicated. And there's a lot of existing systems we rely on in our daily lives, like payment and clearing systems. Like we don't just want things just to break overnight. And there's a risk that if you do it in a very disorderly fashion and there's a crisis, that the political snapback could be very counterproductive. Like Trump, for all, people, lauding him for being pro-Bitcoin, I think fundamentally he's not like a Bitcoiner, right? He's a politician. He's like, this is where I get votes, this is where I get energy, I get money. Boom, this is my support base. I'm going to do things that make them happy. But if all of a sudden this blows up in his face and it makes him look bad, it makes him look stupid or rash, or it embarrasses him, he'd be the first person to do a completely 180 and turn on the community in a second, right? So I think if you don't plan for that scenario, then you're not doing a prudent strategic, making prudent strategic planning, right? Because it's a very tightrope to walk there. So that's my take on this sort of.
I think it also, calls to mind some of the centralization points and, still, I don't know, let's call them weaknesses or risks inherent in Bitcoin. Perhaps centralization of the mining pools is one major topic lately, right? Mm-hmm. Who has a direct line into control of those, mining pools at the moment? Well, probably the CCP does. And, if Bitcoin were to develop very rapidly as a result of some political move like you just described, what does that do to the incentive structure for China or the CCP as it relates to, Bitcoin's long-term success? These are questions people should ask themselves.
Yeah, and I think there has been conversation about, state influence over mining pools for censorship, purposes, whether it's OFAC or whether it's sort of, the implicit threat of, empty blocks or whatever come from some other, not financially motivated actor. I think the lesson, Bitcoin community is always, there's a lot of energy behind lots of things. I think relatively more energy should go into things that decentralize block production. So Stratum v2, I know, is kind of mixed opinions, but I think maybe more in that direction that helps ensure that the block production is as decentralized as possible. And there's just overall thinking about, Bitcoiners are adversarial thinkers, but it's like, okay, like if you are the dog that catches the car and Bitcoin is at the level of gold, well, like there's going to be a whole new raft of threats in terms of not to the protocol itself, but to the developers, right? Sure. There's like 40, 50 core developers. I'm aware they have like a meeting every year. They sort of pick a city, they go there, they just have a conversation. It's just like a technical kind of like vibe session. And these are just like programming. They're very in the weeds, whether this BIP X versus BIP Y sorts of stuff. What's the vibe? Very personality driven sort of discussion, rough consensus. At a certain point, there's half of those are going to be Chinese spies, right? I mean, you've seen this in open source software already. In fact, there was a story just a few weeks ago, I forget exactly when, about for several years, a maintainer, he was actually using a Chinese name, but people think it was probably the SVR, the Russian intelligence service, basically could have worked on an open source library for Linux. It was a very kind of off in the weeds, very small sort of library. It was called XZutils. And it was maintained by one maintainer who had like 50 different libraries they were maintaining. It was kind of getting overworked and want to maintain this like pretty boring set of tools. And so this guy kind of kept offering to help. Submitted small little change requests and pull requests and kind of insinuated himself. It got to the point, and then there was a whole other host of anonymous contributors that were like gradually pressuring the lead maintainer to incorporate these changes from this other guy and be like, why aren't you listening? Like, this is a simple change, you should do it. So they created a bunch of social pressure, and after like 2 years, the guy made the anon SVR officer a co-maintainer, where now he could just push updates, and they got this backdoor built in to like foundational Linux sort of software updates. And it was like this one random, autistic Microsoft engineer who noticed like a slight latency to like his normal compiling. He's like, why is this taking a little bit too long than it used to take? And just like dug in for hours and realized there was this like weird change to the code, and then kind of it whole blew up. And so that tells me, okay, so Bitcoin is more resistant to that sort of attack than Linux is, but it's not entirely impervious to sort of gradual, systematic, manipulation of the conversation around, say, certain types of BIPs, and maybe creation of social pressure, which essentially is, okay, should we signal for taproot type of thing, right? So I think we should be more conscious of those sorts of attacks, like social layer attacks on the technical development ecosystem. In general, I think that should, all things considered, raise the bar for any soft fork, right? Because you always have to factor in the possibility that the public pressure for a certain soft fork, whatever it is, just like completely abstract, could also be manipulated by some unknown purpose, right? And that this pressure to like make a simple change could introduce a flaw that not everyone had figured out. Of course, the whole thing with ordinals was like, some people feel it was attack, some people thought it was just basic change, and whatever is the protocol is protocol. But that lesson you should draw a conclusion from that lesson that in the future, that type of thing could happen again, but like not by accident, right? So like in general, I think that should change like the default posture to updates. Now again, that might make me, that might impose some costs, right? There might be some like simple changes that like time locks, et cetera, that would be good to have. That that wouldn't say that like inevitable. I wouldn't say we say no changes. It's just whatever your current posture is to changes, it should just be slightly more resistant.
Yeah. Well, that's great food for thought, and makes me appreciate especially your style and your contributions to the space, Matt, as someone who, as you said, assesses risk for a living, right? This is literally your job. You do this all day, every day. When you're not, by the way, also writing policy papers about Bitcoin, which, by the way, I highly recommend people read those papers. If you want to support Matt on the Bitcoin Policy Institute website. If you really want to support Matt, by the way, buy his book, Buy Expectation Value. I've ordered my copy. I look forward to reading it soon. I want to give Jesse maybe the almost last word here, and I want to be respectful of your time. This has been awesome, Matt. Really appreciate you. Really appreciate you coming on Scarce Assets. But Jesse, did you have any? Do you have anything you want to say before we give Matt the closing thoughts on where to reach him?
No, not in particular. Incredible contribution here, Matt. To I love your disparate points of view that you're bringing in from our typical Bitcoin community. Talking points are so narrow in scope usually, and you break that mold, which is fantastic and necessary and great. And I agree with you on the sort of ossification point. I think we had VJ on the podcast, and he made an impassioned case for the bias towards ossification, and I think that's an important distinction to not be completely closed off to that possibility of changes in the future. But the bar certainly should be, in my opinion, higher than it has been and currently is with regard to making changes. So I agree with you on that. But thanks so much for coming on the show. This is extremely thought-provoking for me, and I think probably everyone listening.
Absolutely. What any final thoughts or information you want to leave people with?
Final thoughts. Well, I'll leave with the final kind of mega, macro take. Which is,
lay it on us.
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting convergence this decade. A lot's going to happen this decade. I think this is going to be very, the terrible 20s or disruptive 20s, whatever. I think it's true. We're kind of in the middle of it. And, the daily news cycle, depending on what's blowing up that day, kind of focuses on different aspects of this sort of creeping crisis or acceleration of instabilities. I think Bitcoin is sort of going to become one dynamic in this larger, complicated unfolding of, you could call it chaos, you could call it creative destruction, you could call it, whatever you want to call it. But I think there's going to be a lot of convergence, right? So, and, Bitcoin, I think, can play a potentially stabilizing role throughout that sort of crisis environment. I think that's where focus should be on, okay, a lot of the anchor points of global civilization and society are going to be sort of freed up, right? And usually when that happens, lots of things can change. And the purpose of the state and the existing social order is to kind of anchor things down and try to keep things relatively contained. But when things start to pop off the ground and the tent starts flying and everyone runs around with their heads cut off, I think it's important for Bitcoiners to try to keep themselves grounded, try to keep themselves anchored. It probably will not be the full solution to, it doesn't Bitcoin solves everything. But I think the more that Bitcoin can play that role of a stabilizing anchor point as other things potentially get freed loose and have to reconfigure themselves for a while, the better. So I think it'll be a disruptive decade in many respects. I think we're going to end up in 2030s in a vastly different world. Bitcoin will still be around, but I think the world around Bitcoin will be very, very different. Just keep an open mind. A lot of things are going to change. That's all I got.
That's good. That's sage advice. Be cool, Bitcoiners. Try to stay cool. And as this wild drama unfolds, Matt will be keeping you updated live on Twitter, I'm sure, at Matthew_Pines. Matt, thank you so much again. Phenomenal conversation. Hope to do it again sometime before too long, and really appreciate you. This has been Scarce Assets.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the show. If you found the information valuable, please share the episode with a friend or leave a rating on your favorite podcast app. All the links we discussed in today's show will be in the show notes inside your podcast app. Before we finish, a quick reminder that Onramp Media is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and nothing should be construed as investment or legal advice. Regardless of where you are on your Bitcoin journey, we'd love to hear from you. Visit onrampbitcoin.com/contact to schedule a consultation with one of our private client advisors.